Hey, what's up everybody? It's your mortgage expert, Brian McCauley here. So you're looking to buy a house in Dallas, Texas, but you've been hearing about this new change on the commission rule from the NAR settlement, and now that the buyers may have to in fact pay the buyer's agent's commission, and it may be giving you hesitation and move forward on buying a house. Well, stick around in this video. I'm going to tell you the truth, how to work through it, and why it shouldn't stop you from becoming a homeowner. So just as interest rates start to come down and we get some good news, now as a potential buyer out there, we get some crazy news, which is, hey, I heard there was a rule change, Brian, that, moving forward, I as the buyer might have to be responsible for the 3% commission owed to the buying agent or my buying agent. Well, partially true. What I want to do a little bit today is unpack kind of what is happening. I want to go from what it used to be to what it is now, kind of everything in between. And granted, remember, it's still early. There's a lot of opportunities. Stick around for the end of this video because I'm going to go into the lending guidelines. No one's talking about this. It's more about buyer, seller, who's going to pay what, but the lending guidelines, the mortgage people are coming in, and we're going to try to help out a ton. And I think everybody needs to be aware of that. So I'll talk about that at the very end. But regarding the rule, so just to make sure I'm clear on everything, the old rule was, hey, there are a few agreements between a few parties. So there is a listing agent and the seller, they have an agreement. There's a buying agent and the buyer, they have an agreement. And then there's normally a purchase contract between the buyer and the seller. Now, on the seller agreement, on the buyer agreement, there's normally terms and commissions and all these things. But what happened in the past, which is a big component of not what's being allowed moving forward, is in the MLS, the multiple listing public system where people list their properties, the MLS used to allow and say, hey, seller is willing to pay buyer's commission or buyer's commission up to 2-3%, whatever it is. And so the buyer and the buyer's agent knew if they were looking at 123 Main Street, that commission that the buyer was supposed to get stated right there, hey, the seller's going to take care of it, all of it or some, right? So it was just a really good understanding. In the old way, it was always negotiable, but it was just a status quo. And so it was like, hey, yes, this is my commission, but it's okay, we'll get the seller to pay for it. And obviously when they go look for the house on the MLS, outside of them liking the house and getting it all done, it stated that the seller's not only going to pay the commission to their agent, they're also going to pay the commission to the buying agent. So it made it easy on everybody, and this new rule change is not allowing that. So what does that mean for you? Well, it's not the big bad wolf you should be afraid of. It is just a rule, an adjustment change to the market and the industry. It happens. It happened to loan officers back at Wall Street Reform and Dodd-Frank. It's just understanding the fullness of how it all works and what's the best course of action in the beginning to make sure you set proper expectations, and so you understand everything, so there's no big surprises, because that's the last thing anybody wants when buying or selling a house, especially with the rule change this big. So full disclosure, I'm not an agent. I don't pretend to be. I have a lot of great friends and partners that are agents. They know way better than me. But from what I understand as a lender, basically the MLS is not going to allow to state that the seller is going to be responsible, can or will pay any of the commissions for the buyer and the buyer's agent in the MLS. So that's part one. So it is not understood anymore that when you go look at a property, if you're a buyer and your buyer's agent is supposed to get 3% or 2%, whatever it is, that the other side will take care of it. They still can. It's just not going to be obvious in the MLS because they won't allow for the language. So let's talk about some options and some structures. And again, this is going to change shape over the next 6 to 12 months because it's new for everybody, but most people will find a way to make it work. Again, like any market that gets tough, all the good, valuable, hard-working people, whether it's a buyer, agent, listing agent, lender, whatever, they're worth their weight in gold. They will show the value, especially through these tough times. So as a buyer out there, you will probably be a little bit more selective on who you choose and how long they're going to represent you and what's everything you're going to do for me, and before signing that agreement, because the meat and potatoes of this is, as a buyer, you will have to sign an agreement that says, hey, John Doe or Jane Doe is my agent. Their commission is X. I'm just going to use 3% as a round number for purposes of the video. And up front, you as the buyer at that point in time are responsible to pay your buyer agent their commission, ... If at the end of the day, there's no other way for it to get paid. Now, I know a lot of great negotiators and people out there and strategies and structures. And so my gut feeling is, even though you guys sign the piece of paper and you are legally responsible for it, everyone will get creative. Everyone will communicate, because at the end of the day, we obviously don't want the buyers paying for the commission out of their own pocket. You know, buying a house is already expensive. There's already a lot to deal with. If you got to stack another 3% on top of your down payment, closing costs, and all that, it just kind of like waters it down. So part one is they cannot list the MLS information anymore about the seller willing or can be willing to pay X amount of commission for the buyer. Okay, so they're going in blind. Part two is, from what I understand, as a buyer, you can no longer go see a property with an agent unless you have an agreement in place. Now, you can go to an open house by yourself. You can go walk around and do whatever you want. But if you call your buddy Bob, say, hey Bob, can you show me this house real quick? Bob or Shannon is supposed to say, I'd love to. We got to get this agreement, because legally I can't. So even if the intention is good and everyone's cool, from what I've been told, you have to have an agreement in place for an agent to even show you a property moving forward. So it'll make it a little bit more restrictive on the buy side. Does that mean every agent will do it? No. Like I tell people, the speed limit's 70 miles an hour. People speed all day, every day. So we want to encourage doing the right thing. Best practices, I am just relaying the message on the changes from what I know so far. So, agreement to see a house with an agent. Buyer's going to be responsible to pay the agent's commission. Come hell or high water, can't negotiate into the deal. You are responsible for that. Now, let's get into the fun part, okay? All the buyers are probably going, God, is this a scam? This is gonna make it hard to buy a house. It's not. You just have to understand all the nuances and what can and can't be done to really make that commission payable by the seller without it being listed on the MLS. So it all still ends up being the same. It just not going to be the same steps that it used to be. So a few examples. Let's say you sign an agreement to pay your buyer's agent 3%. Whenever you and your agent, he or she, go to look at a property, you may or may not like the property, but one of the conversations that buyers and buyer's agents have to say up front is just, hey, we love the house, but before we make all this stuff work, how much is your seller willing to pay towards the buyer's agent's commission? You have to ask that. So right, in the old days, it was on there. MLS said, we'll pay X. So like, you didn't have to talk about it. It was like, oh, they'll pay this, all good, focus on the house. Now it's focus on the house, but hey, that hanging commission, we got to talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it and figure out who's going to do what and get it all squared away, technically it'll fall back on the buyer and they'll be responsible for it. So there'll be some negotiating skills up front on who pays what and how do you adjust things and get it all squared away. But you have to be a little bit more proactive and drive some clarity and figure out exactly who does what early on in writing, just to protect. Big change in the rules, probably for the best, but at the same time, you can't skip any steps. I mean, I think the change in theory is good from intention, and it will create a little bit more order so things just aren't as sloppy and soft as they were in the past. When you've got these agreements and you've got who pays what, it keeps it a little bit tighter. So there's no big surprises when it comes to signing agreements, who's responsible for what. That's going to be a sticking point and a talking point up front. And I think people need to sharpen their saw on how they present their value add. But I think all the great people already know how to do it. So, you know, listing agents and buying agents are both very, very valuable, but they also have different skill sets. And so depending upon who you're working for and with, you have to make sure and understand that both parties deserve their commission, but they have different skill sets. And you have to be able to validate those when you as the consumer are ultimately responsible for that money, okay? So going into the last part on, okay, well, what do we do now? Buyers have to sign agreements and they're gonna agree who the agent is and how long and what the service is going to be, and that, you know, they're ultimately responsible for the 3% commission. So they gotta work a little bit harder to prove it, but also be able to negotiate it up front with the initial offer and conversations with the owner so they know exactly, hey, that commission's floating around now. You know, even though they'll probably pay for it, it's not listed in MLS anymore. I gotta state it, I gotta figure it out, get it in writing. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's halfway in the middle. But at the end of the day, if you can't get it in there, even if you love the house, that is gonna fall back on the buyer, which ultimately is gonna be more money out of their pocket. So we wanna try to avoid that. Now, there's a million ways that I won't share in this video to work through all that, but I want to finish out and talk about the lending piece. So you got the buyer's agent, you got the listing agent, you got the contract, you got all these things, and everybody's trying to make it work and figure out the concessions and get it all going. So on the lender side, some of the helping components is, there are rules on home loans that talk about, hey, if it's this type of loan, you can get this much percentage of closing cost in the transaction given from the seller, but you can't exceed this amount. And that goes for conventional, FHA, VA, jumbo, all these things. So the bonus here is all of those rules still apply. However, lending guidelines are now allowing for the seller to give more closing cost credit than the original guideline amounts. I'll give you an example here in a minute. And you can go above and beyond what the general closing cost guidelines are, and they can give a credit to the buyer above and beyond the current amount, and it won't violate the loan guidelines as long as that additional amount is given strictly to the buyer, and that buyer uses that money to give it to their agent specific for the commission. So everyone's like, well, that's stupid. It's the same thing. It is. But the law says you can't go from A to B. Now it's got to go from A to B to C, which is seller, numbers in the contract to the buyer, and then buyer turns around and pays that money directly to their agent via commission. Now, there will be a paper trail on that. I will not bore you with that. But the example I was referring to, let's say you have a $500,000 FHA loan. FHA allows for 6% seller concessions. If need be, that would be 30 grand. Obviously, there's not that much, but we're just gonna keep it elementary for a minute. So let's say they got 6% seller concessions for the closing cost, and they used all that money for the cost. Well, if you get any more money for the sellers and seller concessions for cost, you exceed the tolerated amount, therefore it can't be done. In this scenario, you could actually have the seller contribute 9% as a closing cost credit and a seller concession credit, because you could take 6% of that as bona fide closing cost, itemize those and say, hey, over here, great. That 3% that's left over, it can't go towards those costs. Okay, the guidelines say no, these real loan costs, 6%. However, that extra 3 can go from seller to buyer. Buyer can turn around at closing and take that 3% credit from the seller, pay it to their agent, and now their agent is paid in full. That's how you can get more money than what the guidelines allow for on top of the closing cost concession. But as long as and only when that money is allocated to the buyer as a credit for their commission for the buyer's agent, and it's tracked on the contract that way, special provisions, there's a CDA, it'll go on the closing disclosure. I'm sure there's some legal checks and balances on how to get all that done, and obviously I'll do another video on that. But the good news is, if your buyer's agent is good and they're working hard for you, just like they do now in negotiating price, credits, everything else, they can go back and say, hey, Mr. Jones, we'll give you $500,000 for the house. We need $10,000 in closing costs, but we also want a 3% credit in there for X. And so if they can get that in there, they can negotiate that into the deal. So this is where the lending guidelines are giving flexibility to the rules, trying to make sure that we help the buyer. So how does that help the buyer? Well, if the buyer ultimately doesn't have to come out of pocket on the commission amount that's being paid to their agent, it keeps money in their pocket. Therefore, they're financially stronger, they're more inclined to move forward, it's less expensive, it's a win-win, but it comes back to the negotiation skills from buyer's agent, listing agent, property, expectations, conversations, all these things. Now, before we go, I'm gonna throw one last bonus out there that I want everyone to remember, but it's gonna count even more now. Let's say, get a contract on a home. Buyer's agent's supposed to get paid by the buyer. He or she is like, dude, we love this house. We can't get the seller to pay for it. Like, we'll just pay you the 3% out of our pocket. We love it that much, and that's going to happen. So let's say I'm doing the loan. You're buying the house for 500 grand. You've agreed to pay the buyer 3%, or the buyer's agent 3% as the buyer on top of your down payment, blah, 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 blah. Let's say that I order an appraisal, and that appraisal comes back, not at 500,000, but it comes back at 515. Well, before the law changed, I called this extra equity ghost equity. Ghost equity is, wow, your house is actually worth a little bit more than what you paid for it. Congratulations, you are starting out ahead. But it's ghost equity, meaning if you don't touch it or do anything with it, It just becomes a feeling of, oh, that feels good to have an extra 10 or 15 grand in my house, right? What I tell everybody then, and I'm gonna tell everybody now, putting the agent commission thing aside, you wanna touch the equity. So if you had the deal for 500, it came in at 515, you could amend the contract price up, use the $15,000 in equity, and convert that equity into hard dollars, which would benefit you as the buyer a lot more. Why? Well, what feels better? Telling your friend, I got $15,000 in my appraisal, or grabbing the 15,000 bucks and put it in your pocket. Closing cost, interest rate, buy down, all these things, the latter of the two. So the bonus here is if your appraisal comes back higher than the purchase price, you can touch that ghost equity. And if you need that equity, you can always do the same thing. Amend up, touch the equity, restructure the contract, and then as opposed to coming out of pocket 3%, you can have the seller do a credit for 3%, state that it goes directly to the buyer, but it's for the buyer's agent commission. And now that 3% that you were going to pay directly out of your pocket, you obviously are just using the ghost equity to finance it, but obviously it saves you 15,000 bucks. So strong appraisers, strong appraiser panels are really important to make sure they're given the actual value of the house, not just the sales price. I would say about 30 to 35% of our appraisals come in high, maybe $1, maybe 20 grand. Great feeling, but now it's going to be more important than ever to tap into that ghost equity to maximize those funds, not only for you, but potentially for your agent to make sure it keeps you from coming out of pocket any more money. So listen, I know that was a lot of information, but hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, do me a favor, like, comment, subscribe. If you know somebody that could benefit from this video in this crazy, ever-changing market, share it. If you got any questions about this topic, any other topic, want to get pre-approved, talk about the market, strategies in general, do me a favor. Call us, email us, text us. We want to work with you, and we're always here for you. Until next time, stay tuned.